If you think survival food is boring, you've clearly never tasted the magic my grandmother could make out of a few scraps and a whole lot of love. They say history repeats itself, but if we're lucky, so do recipes. And the meals that once carried our grandparents through the hardest days, they might just be the key to surviving tomorrow. You know, I sometimes look around my kitchen today and laugh. There's a machine to make my coffee, one to bake my bread, and another that can roast a chicken while I'm on a conference call. But when I close my eyes, I can still smell the wood smoke from my grandmother's old stove and hear the bubbling of a pot that had been simmering since sunrise. Back then, dinner didn't come from a package. It came from patience, resourcefulness, and a whole lot of love. And the truth is, those old meals weren't just food. They were stories, stories of survival, resilience, and creativity in the face of scarcity. They were proof that a handful of cheap ingredients cooked with care could nourish both body and soul. And I think it's time we remembered them, not out of nostalgia, but because the wisdom baked into those recipes is timeless. Let's start with one of the simplest, most beloved dishes of all, mac and cheese. But I'm not talking about the neon orange stuff in a box that we call comfort food today. I mean the kind my grandmother made when I was a boy. A bubbling casserole of elbow macaroni tossed in a cheese sauce that was whatever she could afford that week. Sometimes it was sharp cheddar. Sometimes a mix of odds and ends from the market. She'd melt the cheese with a little flour and milk, stir it until it coated every noodle, then bake it until the top turned golden and crisp. On the table, it wasn't just dinner. It was comfort, security, and love, all for less than 50 cents. It's funny. Today, chefs drizzle truffle oil over their macaroni and call it gourmet. My grandmother would have shaken her head at that and said, "Why gild the lily when it's perfect as it is?" Another dish that tells a story deeper than its ingredients is rice and beans. My grandfather used to say that this was the meal that built nations. And he was right. You'll find some version of it in every culture that ever faced hard times. In our house, the beans soaked overnight in a big enamel pot, then simmered all day with a bit of onion, and maybe, if we were lucky, a scrap of salt pork for flavor. The rice cooked separately, fluffy and plain, waiting to soak up that savory bean broth. And when we sat down to eat, it wasn't just sustenance. It was a reminder that even the humblest things, when combined thoughtfully, can become something greater than the sum of their parts. And then there was potato soup, the great equalizer. Whether you were rich or poor, farmer or city folk, if money got tight, there was always potato soup. Potatoes were cheap, sometimes practically free if you knew a farmer, and they could stretch into a meal that warmed you from the inside out. My grandmother would peel and dice them into a pot of water, maybe throw in an onion or a celery leaf if she had it. If there was milk to spare, she'd pour a little in to make it creamy. And if a ham bone was hiding in the icebox, that would go in too, lending its smoky essence to the broth. We didn't have fancy spices or fresh herbs, but a sprinkle of pepper and a pinch of salt were enough. And I'll tell you this, to this day, no restaurant soup I've tasted comes close to the richness of that pot, made from nearly nothing. On cold mornings, we'd often wake up to the smell of biscuits and gravy. To most people now, that's comfort food. Back then, it was survival food. My grandmother saved every drop of fat from the skillet, storing it in an old coffee tin on the back of the stove. When she needed it, she'd scoop out a spoonful, whisk it with flour, and pour in milk or water until it turned into a silky gravy. If there was leftover sausage or dried beef, it went in too. If not, the gravy stood on its own, black pepper, carrying the flavor. The biscuits were made from scratch, flour, lard, and buttermilk if we had it, or just water and a splash of vinegar if we didn't. And let me tell you, that simple breakfast could power a man through an entire day in the fields. There was also cabbage and sausage, a meal that taught me the meaning of stretching a dollar. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and available even in the dead of winter. My grandmother would chop it into thick ribbons and cook it down with slices of the cheapest sausage she could find, usually the kind with more fat than meat. Cabbage soaked up every drop of flavor, and sometimes she'd toss in a few potatoes to make it even heartier. That pot would feed us for days, and somehow it tasted better each time we reheated it. To this day, the smell of simmering cabbage reminds me of a warm kitchen on a snowy evening and of a woman who knew how to make magic from so little. Lentil soup was another quiet hero. Back before lentils became trendy superfoods, they were the humble backbone of many families' diets. They were cheap, filling, and packed with protein. And unlike most beans, they didn't need soaking, which made them perfect for last-minute meals. My grandmother would saute whatever vegetable she had, a carrot, an onion, maybe a bit of celery, in a spoonful of saved bacon grease, then toss in the lentils and let them simmer until they turned into a thick, earthy stew. Sometimes she'd splash in a little vinegar at the end to brighten the flavor. That pot of soup might not have looked like much, but it was nutrition, warmth, and comfort all in one. Then there was chili. Oh, chili. It was as flexible as it was flavorful. Some days it was little more than beans, tomatoes, and chili powder. Other times, when we were flush, a bit of ground beef would find its way into the pot. We might throw in corn or a handful of pasta or whatever needed juicing up. Every family had their own version, and every pot tasted a little different. But one thing never changed. Chili was a meal that brought people together. We'd gather around a table, ladle it into mismatched bowls, and pass around slices of bread to mop up the last drops. That was the thing about those meals. They weren't just about feeding stomachs. They were about feeding spirits. And I can't forget Sloppy Joe's, the messy miracle of the Depression era. A pound of ground beef, stretched with breadcrumbs or oats, simmered in a tangy sauce made from ketchup, mustard, and whatever else was in the pantry. Piled high on day-old bread, it became a meal that kids devoured and parents appreciated. I can still remember the grin on my father's face as we tried and failed to eat them without making a mess. When meat was a luxury, egg salad sandwiches became the unsung hero of the lunchbox. A dozen eggs cost pennies back then, and my grandmother would boil them all at once, mash them with homemade mayonnaise, a bit of mustard, maybe a spoonful of pickle relish if she had it. Spread thick on slices of fresh baked bread, it was a meal that kept us going through long days of school and work. And every bite tasted like love and practicality rolled into one. And oh, the sacred pairing of cornbread and pinto beans. In the South, that was more than dinner. It was tradition. Pinto beans simmered slowly with a scrap of salt pork, or just onions and garlic if that's all we had. cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet until the edges were crisp and golden. We'd crumble it into our bowls and soak up every last drop of that rich, flavorful bean broth, the pot liquor, as my grandfather called it. And the next morning, those leftovers would become breakfast patties fried up in bacon grease. Nothing wasted. Ever. You see, back then, leftovers weren't just leftovers. They were opportunities. Every scrap, every spoonful, every crumb had a second life. And nowhere was that clearer than in fried rice. If there was a bowl of rice left from last night's dinner, it never went to waste. My grandmother would spread it on a plate overnight so it dried a little, then toss it into a hot skillet the next day with whatever odds and ends we had on hand. A few scrambled eggs, some chopped carrots, maybe a handful of peas from a can. We didn't have soy sauce most of the time, but a splash of Worcestershire or just salt and pepper did the job. Sometimes she'd slice up hot dogs or scraps of ham into tiny pieces to make it feel more special. And when that pan hit the table, you'd never guess it started as leftovers. It was a whole new meal, reborn from yesterday's dinner. Speaking of hot dogs, those were the workhorse of the kitchen in lean times. Hot dogs and macaroni salad might sound like picnic food today, but back then, they were a reliable and affordable meal. We'd boil or fry the hot dogs and serve them alongside a bowl of macaroni salad, just cooked pasta mixed with mayonnaise, a little mustard, and whatever crunchy vegetables we could spare. Maybe some chopped pickles, maybe some celery, maybe even a few cubes of cheese if we were lucky. That salad would get better the longer it sat in the icebox, and on hot summer nights, it was the perfect way to feed a hungry family without heating up the whole house. Then there was the legendary tuna casserole, a masterpiece of thrift and ingenuity. Canned tuna didn't spoil and didn't require refrigeration, which made it a staple in just about every pantry. My grandmother would mix it with cooked noodles, a can of cream of mushroom soup, and a handful of frozen peas, if we had them. She'd top it with crushed crackers or breadcrumbs and bake it until the whole thing was bubbling and golden. It was filling, comforting, and cheap. And it stretched a single can of tuna far enough to feed the entire family. Even something as simple as a baked potato could become a canvas for creativity. We'd bake a whole batch at once, in the oven if we had fuel, or wrapped in foil and tucked into the coals of the fireplace if we were trying to save. And once they were cooked, the possibilities were endless. Butter and salt were the basics, but we'd top them with leftover chili, crumbled bacon, shredded cheese, or sour cream made from cream that was starting to turn. Sometimes we'd even make a meal out of it. One big loaded potato per person, cheap, filling, and endlessly adaptable. Another staple that never failed to bring comfort was grilled cheese and tomato soup. The soup was usually from a can, Campbell's if we were feeling fancy, stretched with a little milk or water to serve more people. The sandwiches were simple, slices of bread buttered on the outside, with cheese in the middle, grilled until golden and melty. If we had a slice of tomato or a piece of ham, we'd slip that in too. And if butter was rationed, mayonnaise worked just as well, adding a tangy flavor and crisp texture. It was a meal that felt indulgent even when it was dirt cheap. And it's one I still make on rainy days when I want to feel like a kid again. Some meals were a bit more elaborate, but still born from necessity, like stuffed peppers. When bell peppers were in season and cheap, My grandmother would cut the tops off, hollow them out, and stuff them with a mixture of cooked rice, ground beef, onions, and spices. If money was tight, she'd stretch the filling with breadcrumbs or more rice. The peppers would bake in a pan with a bit of tomato sauce, soaking up all that rich flavor as they cooked. It was a complete meal. Vegetables, grain, and protein, all in one neat little package. Beef stew was another classic that turned scraps into something spectacular. My grandmother would buy the cheapest cuts of beef, the ones most folks overlooked, and brown them in a heavy pot until they were deep and rich in flavor. Then she'd add whatever root vegetables we had, potatoes, carrots, onions, maybe a turnip or two. Water or homemade broth would go in next, and the whole thing would simmer for hours until the meat was tender and the vegetables were infused with flavor. She'd thicken the broth with a bit of flour and water, turning it into a gravy that clung to every bite. That stew could feed us for days, and it only got better each time it was reheated. Of course, no conversation about budget meals would be complete without peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. It's almost too simple to mention, but it's impossible to overstate how important they were. Peanut butter provided cheap, shelf-stable protein, and jelly was often homemade from fruit that was too ripe to eat fresh. Sometimes we'd add sliced bananas or a drizzle of honey if we had them, but even on their own, those sandwiches were lifesavers. They filled bellies, fueled busy days, and cost almost nothing, and the fact that the average American still eats thousands of them in their lifetime, that's not an accident. Some meals came from far-off lands but quickly became part of the American story. Cabbage rolls, for example, came with immigrants who knew how to turn a handful of ingredients into a feast. Cabbage leaves blanched until soft, wrapped around a filling of rice and ground meat, or just rice if times were tough, then simmered in tomato sauce until tender. One head of cabbage could make enough rolls to feed a family for days, and they reheated beautifully. And then there was fried Spam, the ultimate symbol of thrift. It arrived on store shelves in 1937 and quickly became a staple, especially during World War II when fresh meat was scarce. My grandmother would slice it thick and fry it until it was crispy on the outside, serving it with eggs for breakfast or rice for dinner. It wasn't fancy, but it was protein, and it kept countless families from going hungry. And you know what? Even today, I still keep a can or two in the pantry, just in case. Ramen noodles, before they became a college dorm cliché, were another humble hero. We didn't always have the instant kind, but my grandmother would cook plain noodles in a seasoned broth made from bones or bouillon cubes. She'd stir in a beaten egg for protein, toss in green onions from the windowsill garden, maybe a handful of frozen peas. It was quick, cheap, and deeply satisfying. Pasta with marinara sauce was another staple, thanks to Italian neighbors who taught us that great food doesn't require expensive ingredients. Canned tomatoes, simmered with garlic, olive oil, and herbs, became a rich, flavorful sauce. A pound of pasta cost just pennies and could feed the whole family. And if there were leftovers, the sauce would be spread on bread for makeshift pizza the next day. Speaking of pizza, homemade pizza nights were a highlight of my childhood. The dough was simple: flour, yeast, water, and a little oil. The sauce was whatever tomato base we had on hand, and the toppings were scraps from the fridge. A few slices of sausage, some leftover vegetables, bits of cheese. It wasn't about making a perfect pie. It was about making something together. And those nights, with flour on our hands, sauce on our faces, and laughter filling the kitchen, are still some of my most cherished memories. And then there was shakshuka, a dish that came to our table thanks to Middle Eastern neighbors. Eggs poached in a spiced tomato sauce, served with crusty bread to soak it up. It was cheap, filling, and felt almost luxurious, proof that simplicity and flavor don't have to be opposites. You know, the older I get, the more I realize that these meals weren't just about surviving. They were about thriving in spite of everything. They taught us resilience, gratitude, and the value of hard work. They taught us that with a little creativity and a lot of heart, we could turn the simplest ingredients into something that brought people together. And they reminded us that the best meals in life aren't always the fanciest. They're the ones shared with people you love, made with what you have, and seasoned with care. So maybe the next time you're tempted to order takeout or toss out those leftovers, think about how our grandparents did it. Pick a recipe from this story. Maybe mac and cheese, maybe lentil soup, maybe just a simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and make it the old-fashioned way. Slow down, enjoy the process. And when you sit down to eat, remember that every bite carries the wisdom of generations. And if these stories warm your heart like they do mine, I'd love for you to stick around. Subscribe to this channel and join me on this journey through the past. A journey where history isn't just something we read about, but something we taste, smell, and share around the dinner table. Because in the end, the meals that sustained our grandparents didn't just feed them. They shaped who we are, and they still have lessons to teach us today.